Good evening. Welcome all. This is the Joint Council and Schools Budget Forecast Annual Meeting. Today is January 31st, 2023. All participating with us on Zoom will be audio and video recorded. And Laura, would you, we need to start by taking a roll of the three bodies that are joining us this evening. Would you be able to do that?
Sure. We'll start with school committee here. Mayor Shara.
Present.
Member Robbins.
I see Member
Not
Robbins.
able to, you see her?
I do. Can you not hear, Member Robbins, can you hear us? Huh. I see.
I'll send her a quick message.
Okay. I wonder if she can
Okay.
hear.
Well, I'm going to note that she's present, but unable to unmute. Member Gehazi, I apologize for my pronunciation if that's incorrect.
Easy. I'm not sure that I see Member Gazy as of yet.
Gehazi. Okay. Member Seraphy Cox.
Present.
Member Stein.
I see Member Stein. I saw him say present. I didn't hear him.
Okay. Member Levy.
Present.
A member Miller.
Present.
Member Goldman.
Present.
Member Agna.
Present.
And Member Davis.
Present.
And Mayor Chair, you have a quorum of the school committee. And then for the council, Councilor Elkins.
I don't think I see her yet.
Okay, Councilor Foster,
I'm here.
Councilor Gore,
Here.
Councilor Jarrett,
Here.
Councilor Labarge.
See Councilor Labarge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Maori,
Here.
Councilor Moulton,
Here.
Councilor Nash,
Here.
and Councilor Perry.
I don't think I see Councilor Perry yet.
Okay, so Mayor Shara, there's a quorum of the city council, and then moving on to the trustees of Miss Vocational. Let's see, Mr. Kalane, or Member Kalane.
I don't see him yet.
Okay. Dr. Spencer Robinson.
Present.
Okay, Mr. Quadro
Present.
and Dr. Janelle Pearson Campbell.
Present.
And we have a quorum of the Board of Trustees of Smith Vocational and Agricultural.
Great, excellent. Okay, so again, welcome everybody. Good evening. Welcome. This is the annual joint meeting with the City Council and the two school districts. I'm very happy to be with you all. As I've said, this has always been one of my very favorite meetings of the year because it's a great window into what makes up the budget and is the one time of year when the schools and the legislative and the executive branches are together. I want to welcome the City Council and Administrative Assistant Laura Krutzler, who is staffing, as you could tell, is staffing the meeting this year, and I thank her so much for doing that. I want to welcome my fellow Northampton School Committee members and Interim Superintendent Pearson Campbell and Business Administrator Bobby Jones. And I want to welcome my fellow trustees of Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School, Superintendent Lincoln Hoker and School Business Administrator Crystal Fairman. I had really hoped that we could be in person this year, but the community room at JFK, where this meeting is usually held, is not quite yet able to accommodate this large a group in a hybrid meeting. So hopefully next year we can do this in person there in that space. So, okay, now I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Okay, I can't see all of you now, so I trust you can see this, but hold on one sec. Let me see if I can get some view of you. Oh, there you are. You're all the way over here. Okay, give me Councilor Maori. For some reason, I can see you. Not if you can see my screen. Excellent. Okay, great. So I'm going to start. And now you see the presentation? Yeah? Okay, great. So here we go. Moving on to the agenda for this evening. Starting with the basics of the budget process and to refresh our memories from last year when we went through them, we're going to identify the revenues for the general fund, discuss property taxes and how they are calculated, highlight Proposition 2.5, which caps the, whoops, sorry, I forgot my mouse is very sensitive, so I got to be careful. Proposition 2.5, which caps the percent taxes can be raised in Massachusetts. And we'll move into then discussing the expenditures in the budget. We'll review reserves and how they are responsibly used to benefit the schools in the city. We will look at how we stack up to our other comparative communities in the region. We will review our revenue and expenditure trends within the city. We'll review the fiscal stability plan for the general fund. And then we will look at FY24 revenue expenditure projections and talk about what is known and what is not yet known at this moment. And then finally, we will review the budget calendar and then have any discussion. Oops. Okay, so moving on to the budget process. The city runs on a fiscal year, which is July 1st to June 30th. The budget process is governed by Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 31, which states that all Massachusetts municipalities are required by state law to prepare balanced annual budgets. According to the annual budget policy section 7-2 of our Northampton City Charter, which was ratified by voters in 2012 and includes the Charter Acts of 2021 after our charter review in 2019. According to that, prior to the commencement of the budget process, the mayor calls a joint meeting of the city council, school committee, trustees of Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School, and the superintendents of both school districts to review the financial condition of the city, revenue and expenditure forecasts, and other relevant information prepared by the mayor in order to develop a coordinated budget. And so here we are. Hold on one sec. Heather, did you have a question? Can you? Heather, I see your hands up. Did you have a question?
I'm sorry, I'm using this on my phone and I'm trying to set settings and I raised my hand by accident.
It's okay. That's why I really don't like using Zoom on my phone, because I press things and I don't know what I've done. Okay, good. I'm glad we clarified that. I'll lower your hand for you and you'll be all set. Okay. So where was I? Okay, so here we are. We are at this joint meeting. So then from that point, Finance Director Nardi and I work closely with the 23 city departments, some of which contain multiple divisions to have departmental budgets that maintain services and identify needs. The superintendents and their business managers of the school districts put together a budget by cost center, working with their schools and departments, which must be adopted by the school committee or trustees and submitted to the mayor 30 days before. The mayor must submit a complete and balanced budget with the schools folded into it to the council no later than 45 days before the start of the next fiscal year. The council must hold a public hearing and vote on the proposed budget within 45 days of receiving it. So that is the budget process. We're now going to talk about the city's revenue sources, how we bring in funds to balance the expenses of the city's operations and services. And, whoops, sorry. This is a list of the revenue types that we have. Starting, we might as well start off with the biggest source, which is taxes. Taxes make up 70% of the city's revenue. This includes the two types of property taxation, real estate and personal property tax, as well as local excise taxes, Excise taxes are taxes imposed on certain goods, services, and activities, like motor vehicle excise and local options on meals, hotel, motel, short-term rental, and adult use cannabis, as well as payments in lieu of taxes, also known as pilot payments, which are payments made by tax-exempt entities to the city to compensate for lost tax revenue. So those are taxes. Here is a list of term definitions as relate to the calculation of the tax levy. They are helpful for understanding the distinctions between the different terms, and it's helpful to be able to go back and refer to them. So as always, I want to remind folks that this presentation is will be available on the city's website at northamptonma.gov under the mayor's budget page with all the past presentations. Tomorrow, this one will be also available there. So you can go back and look at some of these terms. Let me go back to the terms for one more sec and just go over them quickly. Proposition 2.5, which is the maximum limit to which a city can increase property tax levy by each year. The tax levy is the amount that the community can raise through property tax. The levy can be any amount up to the levy limit. The levy ceiling is the maximum that the levy limit can be. The levy ceiling is determined by a calculation, which is 2.5% of the full and fair cash value of all taxable real and personal property in the city. That levy limit is the maximum the levy can be in a given year. And the levy limit can increase by an automatic 2.5% over the last year's levy limit, plus any override the community has voted for, plus the addition of any new growth. It overrides a vote by the city to permanently increase the levy limit base by the amount of the vote, allowing the city to tax more to that amount. New growth is the amount of increased value of new development, building construction, property divisions that is not the result of revaluation. So this is new, not revaluated growth. Levy ceiling changes the total full fair cash value of taxable real and personal property, which can change each year as properties are added or removed from the rolls and as market values increase or decrease. Levy increases, the city can tax no more than its levy limit. However, there's no restriction on the dollar increase or percentage increase in its levy from year to year. Prop 2.5 restricts increases in the limit, not the levy itself, and a community is permitted to tax to its limit. Excess levy capacity is the difference between the levy and the levy limit. It's the additional amount the community could but chose not to tax. So those are some definitions to keep in mind as we look at slide 9, which talks about Prop 2.5. So we can't really talk about taxes here in the Commonwealth without talking about Prop 2.5, which was enacted by the state in 1980 to place constraints on the amount of property tax levy raised by a city or town and on how much the levy can be increased from year to year. The property tax levy is the revenue a community can raise through real and personal property taxes. The levy limit is increased from year to year, as I said, by a maximum of 2.5. Then you add in any overrides or any new growth, and this gets you to the city's levy limit. As you can see in FY21, the city added in the $2.5 million override, but we did not tax against it because of the extreme uncertainty for residents at the beginning of the pandemic. So that override passed in March 2020. It was originally envisioned to be enacted in FY21. It was not enacted or utilized until FY22. So we are right now currently in the second year of that override's use right now. So moving on to, state revenue. The next piece of revenue comes from the state, and it makes up about 15% of our total revenue. It includes Chapter 70 school aid, charter tuition reimbursement, unrestricted general government aid, charmingly known as UGA, payments in lieu of taxes for state-owned land, reimbursement for veterans benefits, abatements to seniors, offsets for incoming school of choice and public libraries, and a few other intergovernmental state revenues, as well as the Massachusetts ambulance certified public expenditure, which is Medicaid reimbursement received as applied for by our fire rescue EMTs. So that is the state revenue that we get. And as I said, it's about 15% of our total revenue. The next largest slice of the pie is revenue for the city from charges for services at around 11%. This includes parking revenues and departmental fees from programs such as the rec department or services from the city clerk or collector. It also includes revenue from inspections done by the health, building, and fire departments. And it includes the tuition for Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School from sending communities. So those are charges for services at about 11%. Next, we go to interfund operating transfers, which make up a little less than 2% of revenue, and it includes the indirects. We charge the enterprise funds and the Community Preservation Act. The indirects charged the enterprise funds are by specific percentages and includes such things as covering a portion of employee health and life insurance costs, workers' comp, unemployment costs, Medicare, general property liability, and a percentage of the general government department budgets that relate to those funds, like the auditors, the collector, and the treasurer. CPA funds are collected at 3% of the tax levy of real property on the amount above $100,000. So the first $100,000 evaluation is exempt. And the Community Preservation Committee is comprised of representative members of multi-member bodies that exist in the city, like the Conservation Commission, Planning Board, Historic Commission, Parks and Rec Commission, Housing Authority, as well as 2 at-large elected members to the CPC and 2 appointed members. And that body is responsible for holding public meetings and receiving applications and making recommendations to the City Council, which is responsible for voting on how Community Preservation Act funds are spent in the 4 CPA areas, which are community housing, historic preservation, open space, and recreation. So those are interfund operating transfers. Moving on to licenses and permits and fines and forfeits, which are a much smaller but important part of our revenues. These include liquor licenses, departmental permits from the city clerk, health department, fire department, and building department, and fines and forfeits. And they're about 0.5%. Fines and forfeits are about 0.5%, which include motor vehicle citations and parking tickets. So those are those little slivers of the pie. Moving on to an even smaller sliver of the pie is federal revenue, which makes up a very small portion of our revenue. Basically, these are Medicaid reimbursements for the schools, which was about $192,000 and changes, and this changes annually depending on the student population. So that is what we get for federal revenue. Next is miscellaneous. Altogether makes up about 0.4%, and it includes PVTA 5 college reimbursement, which is a reimbursement the city gets from PVTA for the buses operation in the city. Includes investment, interest on investments and shared services we provide to other communities and get paid for. For example, Veterans Services regional assessments. So those are miscellaneous. And now we are at projected revenues for the current fiscal year, FY23, the year that we are presently in. So this is an overview of projected revenues for our current FY23 budget, which is now just a little bit more than halfway through this year. Okay. Moving on to expenditures. Oops, hold on. Okay. Expenditures. This is an overview of our expenditures for the current fiscal year, FY23. Education is, as always, the biggest portion of our expenditures. On this slide, it's listed at about 41% of our budget at 45.25 million. But this only includes the direct cost for schools. We'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. The next biggest cost for the city is the employee benefits, health insurance and retirement, and that is at about 20% of expenses, or $22.3 million of our expenditures. Then we have departmental expenditures grouped in their state dictated categories. So those are the pieces of our expenses. Okay, moving on to total actual education spending. As I said before, the previous slide showed only the direct cost for education being 41% at 45.25 million, but that doesn't include the city side costs that are not in the school budget and for which the schools don't have to balance, but the city does. Those include employee benefits, insurance, debt for the schools, cash capital spending, and the indirects, which include the city department services and outgoing charge and school of choice. So for this current year, that is an additional 13.17 million for Northampton Public Schools and 2.14 million for Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School. So when those are all calculated in and are calculated for our net school spending, which we'll go into a little bit more later, the school budgets make up just shy of 55% of our total budget at $60,589,000. And then even this does not, as you'll see this asterisk down here, even this does not include the capital projects for the schools funded from the undesignated fund balance used for capital improvement plan, which was another $675,000 in FY23, this current year. Now, let's move on to talking about reserves. Different than revenue, but still a very critical part of our municipal financial picture. Reserves are not guaranteed to be replenished, so we generally use them for one-time expenses or emergency situations. As you cannot rely on reserves for ongoing recurring expenses, especially, and this is critical, recurring and compounding expenses like salaries. If they are used in the operating budget, they must be done in a planned way with a clear understanding of the impact of their use. Maintaining adequate reserves leaves Northampton better positioned to deal with funding issues in difficult times and gives us the tools to provide continuity of services. Financial reserves provide critical financial stability for emergencies such as weather-related disasters, like flooding, hurricanes, unexpected early snowfalls like we've had sometimes. Also failure of major infrastructure such as a building boiler breaking or a bridge needing to be closed for structural deficiencies, roof leaks, those sort of unexpected big expenditures that unfortunately pop up. They also provide stability for revenue volatility due to regional or national economic downturns, significant change or closure of a tax-producing industry, or changes in state revenues. And also help with closures and restrictions under health emergencies. Again, the fact that Northampton had created reserve accounts gave us flexibility and the ability to pivot very quickly to emergency operations during the early pandemic. Financial reserves are also important for operational stability by funding a capital improvement program that reduces repair costs and improves operational efficiency, preservation of infrastructure, which results in taxpayer savings, by maintaining the city's AAA bond rating, which results in lower borrowing costs for capital improvements, saving hundreds of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money and interest, which allows us to do more with our capital funds. And also they provide operational stability by making planned contributions to the operating budget to extend periods of financial stability in keeping with the fiscal stability plan. So financial reserve uses for the general fund. So in this section, I'll cover the undesignated fund balance and the 4 general fund stabilization funds and their only uses. So general stabilization, capital stabilization, fiscal stability stabilization, and now climate change mitigation stabilization, which was recently created with the enthusiastic approval of the City Council, for which I'm very, very grateful. The undesignated fund balance, also known as free cash, is certified each year by the State Director of Accounts in the Division of Local Services after the books from the previous fiscal year are closed. And that amount is made up of any excess revenues that came in above projections, unused departmental budgets, often because of vacancies or retirements, and also what was left in the fund from the prior year. It's recommended best practice by the Department of Revenue that a city have an undesignated fund balance each year that is 3 to 5% of the general fund operating budget. The city has a policy and a practice of using its free cash in 3 ways. First, to build reserves by putting a portion in the stabilization funds that I'll talk about more in a minute. 2, to fund capital improvements, which are one-time larger expenditures. And 3, to cover operating budget deficits if absolutely needed. But again, this must be done very thoughtfully. So the practice has been to divide free cash into thirds for these purposes, and the use of free cash takes a majority vote by the council. The certification this year also included one-time ARPA loss revenue funds, which was how we received a portion of our total ARPA funds, accounting for revenue loss during the pandemic. The City Council has voted to appropriate these lost revenue funds for a few important purposes, including a fire rescue ladder truck to replace one that had malfunctioned multiple times out on calls, which has been forcing fire rescue to rely on mutual aid for calls needing a ladder truck. By using lost revenue, we were able to rescind borrowing for the truck that the council had approved, which is saving almost $150,000 in interest. The council has also approved the use of these one-time funds for the Resilience Hub, for city-side expenses for Main Street redesign, which is the state transportation improvement project that is happening, will break ground in a couple of years, and for a climate mitigation stabilization fund, which we will talk about soon. And most recently at their last meeting, the council unanimously approved $500,000 of these lost revenue funds for the design, bidding, and construction administration for the needed road safety changes at Northampton High School. The remaining lost revenue is slated mostly for the infrastructure needed for the Main Street redesign that the city is responsible for covering. So moving on to talking about the stabilization funds. General stabilization fund can be used to support projects not necessarily identified in the capital plan, but again, have arisen due to unforeseen or emergency circumstances, or to supplement the operating budget in the case of sharp, unanticipated revenue declines, such as state aid reductions, which thankfully haven't happened recently, or to cover unforeseen operating budget deficits. According to policy, developed in coordination with our financial advisor to reflect best practices as outlined by DOR, Department of Revenue, the target is to reach and sustain this fund at 5% of the operating budget, which we actually have reached this year, only in this general stabilization fund. These funds can only be used with a 2/3 vote of the council. Moving on to the general fund capital stabilization fund, it can only be used for the funding of capital improvements identified in the 5-year capital plan, which is a renewing plan that is approved annually by the council. That target is also to reach and maintain 5%. In this fund. Next is the Fiscal Stability Stabilization Fund, which was established in FY 2014 and is designed to be funded by the city's annual revenue by a Prop 2.5 override, and then setting those funds aside and using them carefully in future years to extend the number of years between needing to seek another operating override. This is extremely important. These funds need to be used in a planned way because use of fiscal stability stabilization funds represent revenue loss. If you're using those funds, it's because you don't have enough revenue for your operations. So you have to find that revenue somewhere in a sustainable way because you're using one-time money. This plan is our recognition and response to the purposeful revenue hole that Prop 2.5 was unfortunately designed to put municipalities into. So every year the budget increases if services are to be maintained. This is reality and logical when you understand that in addition to whatever rising costs there are, the largest portion of the operating budget is for personnel. And every year there are contractual salary increases with both steps and percentage COLAs that compound every year. So unless those increases are 2.5% or less, or there is a new source of revenue or enough new growth, then the city or town will not be able to keep up with those increases without making cuts. So using free cash to fund this, remember it's now one of the 4 funds, our 1/3 of free cash is divided into, and using those funds in the operating budget creates a hole in the budget that must eventually be filled by a general fund override. Or if we are fortunate, another source of increased revenue, as was the case with the addition of the cannabis tax revenue after the 2014 override. So the use of this fund must be done very carefully and in a planned way, which is how it was designed to be used to stabilize and allow sustainable and consistent increases annually to maintain services and avoid the roller coaster of cuts and then replacements that had previously been the situation before the implementation of the plan. Moving next to the Climate Change Mitigation Stabilization Fund. Again, this stabilization fund was just very recently created by order according to Mass General Law, Chapter 40, Section 5B, which provides that the City Council may create a stabilization fund for any lawful purpose. And it was created and now has been funded, initially funded using one-time ARPA loss revenue funds. The purpose of this fund is to plan for cost to implement our climate resilience and regeneration plans, including design and strategic planning. The projects to decarbonize our buildings, especially the schools, to get to net zero are extremely expensive. So we want to make sure that we're earmarking funds for these goals. Also, having some designated funds gives us flexibility and positions us well to be ready to take advantage of and leverage state and/or federal grants. I just had the opportunity to share the news that Northampton had created this fund with Senator Markey in Boston about a week and a half ago, after he presented to Massachusetts mayors about the energy security and climate change programs in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. He was very enthusiastic about this innovative approach that we were taking and told me so that he thought that this was really kind of a remarkable step that Northampton was taking. I'm also announcing that on the council agenda this Thursday is an administrative order to create a Department of Climate Action and Project Administration. If approved by the council, this department, with careful planned use of the Climate Change Mitigation Stabilization Fund, will guide the city's efforts to realize the goals outlined in the Sustainable Northampton Comprehensive Plan, as well as apply a sustainability lens and project management principles to all city projects. As we talked about earlier, our current policy takes 1/3 of our certified free cash and allocates it equally between the 3 current stabilization funds. In the future, we will add this stabilization fund to that allocation. So those are the reserve funds. And these are their current reserve balances. And this is 23-24 reserve history. This is an overview of the reserve history from the last 10 fiscal years. The city used its reserves. You can see in FY13, you see there's very little there. The city used its reserves in the Great Recession. And in FY 2013, the city was able then to begin rebuilding these reserves. And thanks to good fiscal stewardship and the creation of the Fiscal Stability Stabilization Plan, you can see the steady increase in our bond rating in relation to the building back up of our reserves after the recession. Again, these provide the city with flexibility in times of crisis and allow us to maintain a robust capital improvement plan and maintain and upgrade our infrastructure. They give the city the tools to maintain continuity of services and continuity of staff and absorb sustainable annual increases. And they now will allow us to better plan and execute our decarbonization municipal and citywide goals. Moving on to the bond rating, the city has a AAA bond rating from Standard & Poor's, which is the highest possible bond rating. Our bond rating is based on the financial stability of the city, the economy of the city, our financial policies, and importantly, our adherence to those policies and our management practices. If you let me sort of brag on us a little bit, or actually really, I'd like to brag on Director Nardi and the financial team. You'll see from the excerpts from our most recent September 2022 bond rating report that Standard & Poor's said that Northampton has a very strong financial management environment that they, S&P, expect will continue through recent personnel changes and strong institutional framework. Also that management work to maximize the use of federal relief funding and limit taxpayers' exposure to unbudgeted health and safety costs. And officials develop revenue and expenditure assumptions using up to 10 years of historical trends in combination with forward-looking long-term financial planning. And their stable outlook for us reflects their view that the city will maintain a strong, stable financial profile supported by its very strong financial management policies. So you'll see here on the right that we have the highest bond rating of the other 11 communities that we use as benchmark comparisons. We'll talk more about those communities soon. So the question is, why is a bond rating important? It's important because it enables the city to borrow and at the lowest interest rate. Because of our top rating, we are considered the best possible risk and therefore can borrow at the lowest rate, which saves us considerable money in interest on bonds. So that is why it is important. Next, we are going to move on to a comparison of key financial indicators. These are areas in which we compare ourselves to those 11 other communities we just saw to see how we're stacking up to other municipalities. The 11 were chosen because of their proximity to us and because of either they are of similar size, have similar staffing patterns, or have a comparable population to us. These communities have been used for the last decade in these comparisons. The rankings or where we fall can change over time, so reviewing these annually gives us a snapshot of what is happening around us and how we rank as a community in comparison. So the first comparison we'll see is for our tax rate. Our tax rate this year is $15.84 per $1,000 evaluation. You'll see that the city of Northampton in this current fiscal year is in the lower half of the group for residential tax rates. And we are pretty close in rate to the 6th lowest in this comparison group. The Board of Assessors makes a presentation to the City Council annually for the council's tax classification hearing, after which the council votes to set the tax rate. This happened on November 3rd, 2022. And again, our tax rate this year is $15.84 per 1,000. Moving on to commercial tax rate. The city of Northampton has a single tax rate, also known as a factor of 1. Out of the 12 communities, including us, we are the 3rd lowest for commercial tax rate, making us very attractive for business. These top 5 all have what's called a split tax rate. Now, here we see what I think many are certainly feeling, which is that home values remain strong or high in Northampton. So you see we are the 3rd of this group. We are the 3rd highest home value rate at an average of $424,527. This year we've added this slide so you can see how home values have also increased in all of the comparison communities. If you follow housing news at all, you know that rising home values has been not just a sort of local regional or even a state conversation, but also a national conversation. So you can see that just between, so the lighter teal is FY23 and this darker kind of greenish teal is FY22. So you can see that every community has had an increase in their single family home value just in the last year. Oops. And that is reflected in the average single family tax bill, which is calculated by taking the average value multiplied by the rate. As you can see, we are ranked higher within this group because of our higher home values, but are significantly less than Longmeadow and Amherst. As we discussed last year, the city has options for those who are older and have less income, and I strongly encourage people to contact the assessor's office to discuss possible options or to visit our website and search under tax relief programs for assistance. Moving on to new growth value. This is the value of new construction, land divisions, and building permits. FY23 new growth is from projects done between July 1st, 21 and July 1st, 22. Some of those larger projects, some of the larger projects are ones that have spanned multiple years. And some of these projects that are contributing to this new growth are 11 new homes at Emerson Way, homes, condos, and the 53 unit affordable housing complex at Village Hill, the Hawley Street condos, some that are completed, some that are partially complete, more condos at Bridge Street, and 31 additional single family homes. Additionally, new business accounts account for $3,168,560 of this new growth. This strong new growth is excellent news and shows that people are really interested in investing in Northampton, and that will continue to drive our economy. Now, this is total new growth. So the new growth on the previous slide equates to over $1 million we can add to increase our levy limit. We see that there. Now moving on to Chapter 70 as a percent of required net school spending. I said we'd talk more about net school spending. Here is a comparison of the percent of required net school spending contributed by the state to each community with Chapter 70 funds. As you can see, other than Longmeadow at 20.5%, Northampton's two districts receive far less state support than the other comparison communities. We are what's called a minimum aid community because of property values, income, and demographics. Even though Amherst has a larger single family home value than Northampton does, the Chapter 70 calculation for income includes higher education students. So the university and two colleges in Amherst reduce their income levels, which increase their state aid. So that's why they get significantly more state aid than we do, even though some of their other indicators are higher. This is the general fund revenue by source in this kind of graph. This shows how each of the communities compare using our top three revenues. Again, taxes, state aid, and local receipts. As you can see, the city, as I just showed you before with Chapter 70, the city of Northampton receives less state aid than all the other communities except for Longmeadow, which is right here to the left. And we also have significantly greater local receipts than all of the other communities. So local receipts is this kind of orange part. So you'll see we're at 12.04. Whoops, sorry. Hold on. We're at 12.04. The next highest is Longmeadow at 3.67. So So the good news about these local receipts is that we are succeeding in offsetting our lack of state support with other revenue other than property tax. So it's good that we have higher local receipts. But it also means that when those local receipts are impacted by an event like a pandemic or a downturn in the economy, the city feels that impact greater than other communities who rely less so on local receipts. Now we will review the trends we're seeing for some of our revenues and expenditures. And specifically the trends in these 6 areas. First up, general fund revenues. Again, here's that pie chart showing our FY23 revenues and their percentages. So new growth, as mentioned, our new growth is from new construction, land subdivisions, condominium conversions, and property renovations. It's a reflection of investments and growth within the community, and we've been seeing generally strong growth for the last few years. And we are certainly grateful for that. Next, cannabis excise tax. This represents the 3% cannabis excise tax that we receive from the state on a quarterly basis. As you can see, we received only 2 quarters in FY19 at the start of adult use cannabis sales. That's quarters 3 and 4. Fiscal year 2020 was our highest year at $1.64 million in revenue. FY 2021 was down a bit to $1.38 million. And FY22 continued the downward trend at $1.15 million. And so far in the first 2 quarters of FY23, we are seeing a continued decrease in cannabis excise. As the market has become more diffuse in the Commonwealth, and as I've been saying with our neighboring states of Vermont, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island beginning adult use retail sales in the last few months, I expect that we will continue to see a decrease in this revenue source. We also had the first closure, not sale, of a retail cannabis store in the entire Commonwealth here recently. So to give you a little context for what we're seeing in 23 compared to 22, quarter 1 in 23, we brought in $245,832. That same quarter in FY22 was $344,214, so about $100,000 difference. And in quarter 2, FY23, we've just received $209,122 in excise tax. And in FY22, it was $306,079. So again, somewhere around $100,000 difference we're seeing each quarter between last year and this year. Thankfully, over here with hotel, motel, and meals tax, we have a rosier picture. You can clearly see in FY21 the effect of the pandemic when those revenues took a very serious hit. In FY22, hotel, motel taxes rebounded entirely and exceeded pre-pandemic years. Meals taxes also rebounded well, though Omicron kept 3rd and 4th quarters from returning to 2019 levels. The first 2 quarters of FY23 have been very strong for both hotel, motel, and meals taxes. I want to take a moment and give a huge shout out to my office's economic development team and the arts and culture department and our collaboration with the DNA and businesses. And I also want to give huge thanks to the City Council for their support. The economic development efforts we've made around increased outdoor dining and programmed entertainment and community space downtown with Summer on Strong and Masonic Street Live, which had Monday salsa lessons and then Saturday salsa in Pulaski Park, as well as other programming in those spaces, and bringing back the taste of Northampton after 18 years of it being on hiatus. which we brought back thanks to a regional economic development grant that the mayor's office applied for. All of these things and the economic development efforts made by the economic development team have really helped these revenues, I think, not just recover, but as you can see, we hope to be stronger. So huge thanks to everybody for supporting and being a part of that. Moving on to parking revenue. Parking revenue is collected monthly directly by the city instead of through the state. So we are able to see comparisons more quickly in real time, which is why you can see the third and fourth quarter impact directly in FY20 of the pandemic. So, and then in FY21, you see the entire impact on that year. In FY2023, we've been running at about the same level as FY22. We still can't know whether remote work is going to change that baseline for parking revenue. As meals tax has rebounded and it's clear that people have been enjoying the downtowns, we're trying to figure out what the reduction is from. Some of the reduction perhaps could be also a welcome change that matches our climate resilience and regeneration plans. If people are walking and biking more downtown or using less single occupancy car trips. So this is something that we are looking at carefully and trying to determine sort of where it's going to level out to. Next, we have building permits. For FY23, we projected lower revenue for building permits because construction, inventory, and labor have been impacted by the pandemic and the economy. We are pleased to see that second quarter revenue reports show that those issues may be lessening. We're hopeful that our actual revenues will exceed our conservative estimate for this fiscal year on building permits. Okay, back to state aid. And this is the chart I go back to over and over again. It's now a year older, it's a year longer, and I would say it's no less illustrative of the situation. Our net state aid for the last 21 years shows that it doesn't change all that much. So this excludes offsets for school choice, which go directly to schools, and offsets for libraries, which go directly to libraries. But as you can see, we get significantly less state aid today than we did in 2002. Then we received about $13.5 million in state aid. So this chart is not adjusted for inflation. It's not the relative value. This is actual dollars. We get actual less dollars in state aid than we did 21 years ago. So as we all know, expenses haven't remained flat. So what it means is that we get less actual state dollars than we did 21 years ago, and we get less for our state dollars because they have remained stagnant over this time. It also means that there's increasingly more pressure on local revenues as we have to make up the difference, which we've talked about. So 70% of those revenues come from property tax that are capped at 2.5%. We have elected a new governor, Governor Healy. Generally under Mass General Law, the governor's budget proposal is due the fourth Wednesday in January, except when there's a new term, in which case the governor gets an additional 5 weeks, which I certainly don't begrudge her. At the Massachusetts Municipal Association conference on January 20th, Governor Healy announced that her budget would in fact be delivered on March 1st, meaning that she would take those additional 5 weeks. As we do not have yet what's called the cherry sheet from the governor, you'll see in a few slides that we need to estimate what we'll get for state revenue, which again is about 15% of our total revenue. We saw a very small increase in state aid with the final passage of the state bill in FY23. We will see what this budget brings for us. Speaking of the now governor, when she was here in Northampton still as a candidate in October for a tour of downtown, before she left, I actually had printed out this chart and I handed it to her and told her that this is one of the biggest challenges for our city. And I asked her to work with me around state aid equity, especially for Chapter 70. So again, I continue to be a bit obsessed with this chart. Moving on to expenditure trends. Let's talk about these trends in these 4 areas that you see. Again, here's the expenditure pie. And so these are percentages not accounting for indirects. And the biggest non-operational expenses in our budget are health insurance, retirement, and other insurances, and workers' comp. So starting with health insurance is 11.4% of our FY23 budget. And that amounts to $12,634,303, which was up from $12,165,937 in FY22. So, so that was, you can see that increase here on this chart, and you can see that there was almost $1 million increase between FY21 and FY22. What the insurance increase will be for this fiscal year is one of our biggest unknowns, and it is one of our biggest expenditures. We won't know it until premiums are set in March. So for this presentation, we're estimating a 6% increase based on the recent GIC is Group Insurance Commission. Based on their recent meeting, we are estimating a 6% increase to health insurance. Again, our second largest, well, our largest non-operational expenditure. Moving on to retirement. All City of Northampton employees, excluding licensed school staff who are part of a state system, participate in the Northampton Retirement Board contributory retirement system. Prior to 1998, there were no regulations for retirement contributions, and therefore municipalities just contributed on a pay-as-you-go basis. However, in 1988, the law changed and required that we not only pay for the current retirees, but put away and fund for future retirements. All retirement plans must be fully funded by June 30th, 2040. Our system is targeted to be fully funded by fiscal year 2037. The other insurance costs of the city are workers' comp, general liability, auto insurance, fire and police workers' comp, and property insurance, all of which, as you can see, generally go up like most things. Massachusetts Interlocal Insurance Association, MIA, provides our insurance. Our insurance premiums can be offset by training and credits. We're within a group with many other Massachusetts communities, which reduces the costs, and we get many other benefits this way. So those are our other insurances. Oops, hold on. Wait a minute, what's that? There we go. Okay, education spending. So again, we can't talk about state aid without talking more about Chapter 70, which is state aid to public elementary and secondary schools to support school operations. Chapter 70 also sets a minimum spending requirement for each school district and a minimum requirement for each municipality's share of school costs. This slide shows the budgets for our 2 districts. Gray is Smith Vocational Agricultural, teal is Northampton Public Schools over a 10-year period. The cost of education, of course, as you see, continues to go up. Now let's talk more about net school spending. This slide shows the proportion of the budgets that are Chapter 70 and non-Chapter 70 local net school spending funds. Net school spending is the amount determined by the state that must be spent on education by the municipality. Chapter 70 plus our required local contribution to get to net school spending is called the foundation budget. The foundation budget is required net school spending. The community must meet this required net school spending with its contribution plus Chapter 70. The foundation budget is adjusted annually to reflect changes in enrollment, demographics, inflation, and geographical wage differences. And wealth factors also play a part in the formula. You can see how the city support of the budget is continually rising, yet state aid remains relatively flat. So again, the teal is Chapter 70 or state aid, and the brown is Northampton's contribution to get to net school spending. Again, this highlights the pressure on the community to continue to provide a high quality education without an increase in state support. Our local support of our schools is vitally important, and it is one of the qualities that I most admire in this community. But the state's continual failure to meet rising school needs and costs makes it harder and harder for the residents of Northampton to make up and exceed that difference. Moving on to actual net school spending. So I just previously said exceed the difference. I say that because here we see that required net school spending from the previous slide with the local contribution was above that flat teal line of Chapter 70 contribution compared to actual school spending for the Northampton Public Schools for each year over a 10-year period. So each year, Northampton has spent more than that very significant difference needed to supplement Chapter 70 to get to required net school spending. And that amount over net school spending keeps growing. In FY21, it was $8.3 million over net school spending. In FY22, it was almost $11 million. And in FY23, we are estimating it will be $11.7 million over required net school spending. So again, while required net school spending, which is determined by formula by the state, went up from FY22 to FY23 by $1,489,704. So that's that amount determined by state formula. Chapter 70 aid, also determined by state formula, increased by only $159,560. Hold on. Oops, hold on. Sorry, this is Northampton. I wasn't looking at which slide I was on. And then this is Smith Voc. FY23 estimate over net school spending for Smith Voc and Agricultural High School is $306,360, or 3% of our contribution in Chapter 70. Total Smith Voc appropriated budget is $10,115,945. City is paying $1.5 million of that, including Chapter 70, which is 16% of the total budget. The remaining budget comes from the sending communities on a per student basis. Our Northampton students make up around 22% or 125 of their entire student population. Therefore, our amount over net school spending tends to be much lower than the amount for the Northampton Public Schools. So this is Smith Voc. Okay, slide 54, education spending that is not in the school budget. These are the expenditures that support the schools and staff, but for which the schools don't budget or account for. They're fully paid out of the city operating budget. They are Medicare contribution for all school employees at 1.45% of payroll, health insurance for all school employees that take the city health insurance, retirement funding for non-certified staff, such as paraprofessionals, school clerical, custodial staff, and cafeteria staff, insurance for all school buildings and vehicles, shared city services such as human resources, central services, and IT, all capital planning projects. The total for NPS was $625,000 last year, and Smith Vocational was $436,000. School choice tuition for residents who choose to send their students to another district's public school, and net charter school tuition. So tuition minus the state reimbursement, which is a whole nother conversation we could have at some point about the state's dereliction of their commitment. So that's tuition for residents who choose to send their students to a charter school. For the current FY 23, fiscal year 23, estimated education spending outside of the school budget is $13,135,785 for the Northampton Public Schools and $2,319,628 for Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School. Okay, let's spend some time on the fiscal stability plan. Here is a history of the contributions and uses of the fiscal stability plan since its inception in FY 14. With the passage of that override in 2013, some funds were used to make up the FY 14 shortfall, and the stabilization fund was created and funded with the remaining $774,090. As you can see, since the creation of the fiscal stability plan, fiscal stability stabilization plan, we only have used funds in FY 19, 20, and 21. There below the line is in white is where the fund was used to balance the budget and stabilize government expenses since FY 14. The dark teal is the balance of the fiscal stability fund, and the sort of olive green is the interest and contributions from the undesignated fund balance voted by the City Council. With the passage of the most recent $2.5 million override in March 2020, which again was not implemented until FY 22, and we are not anticipating the use of the fund, hopefully for FY 24. So we are in the second year of the utilization of that override. Okay, now we're going to move on to projections. And major projections for major revenue sources. As highlighted in earlier slides, these are the top 3 revenue sources that we need to project for to be able to create the budget. Starting off with real and personal property, with the 2.5 automatic increase and an estimate of new growth at around $800,000, we know we can raise an additional $2,606,523. Next, state aid or the cherry sheet. Again, the governor's not yet released her budget, and we won't have it until the beginning of March. So absent the actual cherry sheet, we must make estimates based on last year's numbers. The top sections are the revenues we see from the state. And then the bottom section are the assessments that we owe to the state. So the net state aid is calculated by subtracting the assessments from the revenues. The 2 numbers that we have estimated at this point are Chapter 70 at $30 per pupil, which is what it often is, and a 3% for UGA, unrestricted general government aid. The rest we are plugging in last year's numbers to be able to estimate until March 1st. Unless there are massive changes with this governor's budget, the cherry sheet is not going to be a real game changer for us. As we talked about, it doesn't, we don't tend to get big increases from state aid. We can hope and pray though. Okay, projected changes in revenue for FY 24. As a preliminary projection, we anticipate revenues to increase by almost $4 million, which was about the increase from last year. Again, we don't know state aid, though it's, as I said, been a consistently modest increase. We're predicting some of our local receipts to continue to rebound, and in the case of hotel, motel, and meals, show an increase. As we've discussed, cannabis revenue is consistently decreasing. Parking hasn't rebounded to pre-pandemic levels, so we're estimating level funding for parking. The decrease in fines and forfeits you see here is due to a reduction in parking ticket revenue, probably because there are less people parking. The first 2 quarters in FY 23 are lower than they were in 22, and we continue to watch this revenue source closely. State aid, estimated increase in Chapter 70, as I said. is at a conservative $30 per pupil and a 3% UGA. We are projecting a reduction in veterans benefits though, as there are less benefits, less veterans to serve. Licenses and permits, we have projected an increase. The major contributors to increase are building inspector wiring and weights and measures permit revenues, which we see returning closer to pre-pandemic levels. Fees, we've reduced some department fees based on 3-year averages showing a decrease, for example, in collector and municipal liens. Miscellaneous changes, we're projecting a decrease in interest on taxes and Medicare reimbursements from schools, which have been trending downwards. So that is our preliminary estimate of increases, 3,970,692. Whoops. Okay. Oops, still the wrong one. Preliminary 62, preliminary FY24 revenues. Here is a look at our projected preliminary revenues. At this point, we are not projecting the use, as I said, of the Fiscal Stability Fund. We're taking a close look at our revenues projections to address issues of inflation and other increases in the city. Okay, projected expenditures. What we know for expenditures is that the retirement contribution will increase by $293,740. And we are again this year proposing to increase our OPEB, our other post-employment benefits contribution, by $25,000. Again, the state is requiring that all retirement plans be fully funded by June 30th, 2040, and our plan has us reaching that by fiscal year 2035. I may have said 37 before. It's actually been revised to 35. So again, OPEB is a future liability for the city. It's not specifically required by the state yet, but it's important for the city to make yearly progress towards fully funding this liability. We are currently at 76.4% of being fully funded based on the retirement board vote in June 2022. And that vote was based on an actuarial study, which is done every 2 years. The board sets 2-year assessments, which puts us on schedule to be fully funded again in 2035, with a return assumption of 6.9%. And our rate of amortization schedule is 3.45%. The debt service line, as we are very well aware that interest rates are going up, we're being very prudent in our borrowing strategies and are looking at using reserves when possible instead of borrowing now that rates have increased. Cash capital, we're proposing an increase in the use of cash capital over last year in the amount of $29,000 towards the FY24 capital plan. Here you can see Smith Vocational Agricultural High School and Northampton Public Schools. I am committing to a 4% increase to the school districts for 2024. I'm making this commitment this year in recognition that our schools are still struggling to recover from the pandemic and its impact on learning and our social and emotional well-being of our students, as well as all of our social and emotional well-being. And to assist with addressing the deficit that has been created by the over-reliance and use of school choice funds and non-recurring revenue like federal relief ESSER funds, or for use of those non-recurring funds for recurring and compounding expenditures. It is unusual and not sustainable to have this high a percent increase after a previously high increase year. Last year, the actual increase for Smith Vocational was 4% and was 5.07% for the Northampton Public Schools. At 5.7%, that was the second highest increase in 15 years for the Northampton Public Schools. The highest being 6.27% in FY14 after the June 2013 override. The previous year in FY13, the increase had been 0.5%, and it was followed by a 3.3% increase in FY15, and then was somewhere around 3% going forward until the pandemic and the March 2020 override. Again, the June 2013 override established the Fiscal Stability Plan and Stabilization Fund, which was used to fill the deficit then and allowed for a more sustainable percent increase for the schools for the following years to stop that roller coaster of an increase followed by a drop to 0% or even negative some years, and then back to an increase. The creation of this allowed more stable funding and consistencies for the schools and their staffing. The goal is again to return to a stable place with consistent, reliable, and sustainable percent increases for the schools. As we said, we don't yet know what sending tuition for charter and school choice is going to be or other cherry sheet charges. So for projected expenditures, this leaves $1,751,991 for all the things we don't know yet. And as I said, those are some big items, namely health and other insurances. Remember that the health insurance increase last year was almost $500,000. And the year before that, it was over $1 million. At this time, we're estimating 6% for insurances, which is about $758,000. Then you add to that we also have departmental budgets that will be hit by inflation and increased energy costs, as well as personnel increases based on the most recent negotiated contracts. So that is what we need to fit into these remaining revenues. So what does this mean for the FY24 budget? While there's still a lot unknown, and there are ways in which we are still recovering from the pandemic and its economic uncertainty, we do know that Northampton will continue to maintain a competitive residential and commercial tax rate compared with neighboring communities, that our single family home values remain strong as the city continues to maintain high quality municipal services, schools, public safety, public works, public health. We know that our new growth will continue to provide additional levy capacity in FY24, with the preliminary estimate being $800,000. We know that some local receipts such as meals tax and hotel motel have rebounded to pre-pandemic levels. However, parking's not come back, and some other revenues like adult use cannabis are declining. Inflation, high energy costs, and supply chain issues will also continue to impact departmental budgets. And the city will continue to be conservative and careful in its budgeting and management practices. So this brings us to our budget calendar. Here we are, January 31st at our joint meeting. Next March 2nd is the deadline for the 5-year capital improvement program to be submitted to the City Council. April 14th, 2023 is the deadline for the Northampton Public Schools and Smith Vocational and Agricultural High School to submit adopted budgets to the mayor. May 16th, 2023 is the deadline for the mayor to submit proposed City of Northampton the proposed City of Northampton, that should say FY24 budget to the City Council. And then June 30th is the deadline for the City Council to hold a public hearing and vote on the proposed, again, that should say FY24 budget. So that is the calendar going forward. And that is it. Thank you. Let me figure out how to stop sharing my screen so I can see all of your faces. Okay. Hi, everybody. Y'all still with me? 66 slides later. Oh, I got some thumbs up. That's great. Okay. Let me make sure I can see as many of you as I can. Okay. So there you go. That is the presentation and our projections for next year. Have I lulled you all into a stupor? Council President Nash, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Mayor. That excellent presentation. and you picked right up where Mayor Narkowitz left off, and there's no difference between the two. They're super informative and full of really good information. So just two big questions I have relative to the budget. First of all, so the good news is I didn't hear you say the word override, and that you're seeing that the fiscal stability plan we're on course to not need an override in the coming year. And I'm wondering if you could speak to when you think that, because we know that they're inevitable, and when you project that might be happening. And then I got another question after that.
Okay. So I definitely did say the word override many times, but you're right that what I said.
You didn't say
that
this year.
You're not projected to go over the cliff with the fiscal stability stabilization plan in the coming year. So again, we are only currently in the second year of that plan. They are generally planned to be 4 years long. We delayed the implementation of it a year, so we're only in the second year of it. We're watching it very carefully. It's one of the reasons why we are trying to make sure that our reserve is strong, and so that we can push it to at least when it's expected to be, which would be in, let's say, a couple more years. Finance Director Nardi, I see, is on the screen. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, you're absolutely right. Initially, I think it was planned for FY 2025, but I know Mary Shara is really looking at revenues and doing her best to make sure that that we don't have to go out for an override, sooner. FY 2025 would be the earliest I think we're projecting, but our hope is to push it off even one more year than that.
Excellent. That's good news, and I appreciate the work that Mayor and that you and your staff are doing. The other question I had to do with the fair share amendment, and the anticipation of that there might be additional revenues coming our way. And I'm wondering when you had a chance to talk with the governor, if you had a chance to talk about that as well. I don't remember her making note of the fair share amendment while she was making her speech to the MMA, but I'd be interested in hearing if we anticipate any money from the fair share amendment.
So she did mention it in her speech, and what she said is that she's looking at it potentially for busing for districts. So she sort of hinted that one of the things that she's looking at is sort of melding the two sort of stated purposes for it, which were education and transportation, and kind of putting them together and maybe using them to help fund transportation in districts. But that's like really the only information we got. I spoke to Senator Comerford a couple days ago to ask if there were any sort of updates on it. There's no sort of solid updates yet as to how it's going to be used or how it's going to be distributed. There's thankfully sort of continual talk about it not being replacement, but being sort of additional revenue. Like that's what we want to hear, right? We don't want that money to be used instead of the other money that was used for our state aid. We want it to be on top of. So there's a recognition of that she's hearing. But other than that, there's unfortunately not a lot of information yet.
Okay, I look forward to that. And also, I was listening to her on about 3.5 hours sleep, so I might have missed that small detail.
It was subtle, and again, there's There wasn't a whole lot there. It was just.
There
part of the-
there wasn't an applause line for the fair share amendment. I would remember that. So anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I cede my time and to other folks here. Thank you.
Thank you. And so along those lines, again, it's critical that we all, we push to get it passed, but what's really critical now is that we push to make sure that it's implemented in a way that benefits all public school districts, but that it benefits Northampton. The Student Opportunity Act, as wonderful as it is and how sort of game-changing as it is for some communities, like gateway communities, it has virtually no impact for Northampton. So what's critical for us is that somehow we get a fair share of the fair share. So I'm going to ask you all to keep pushing on that with me as much as possible. And that means, certainly our state legislators know this and will fight for this, but as much kind of wind to their backs that we can give them is great. And we got to keep pushing on this, that it needs to be implemented in a way that shows some kind of significant equity for communities like ours.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Member Stein.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions that came up when I was looking at some of the figures that you provided. And you may not have the exact answers, but if there was a sense, that would be great. The first is for the comparison towns and cities that we looked at. Do we know what percentage of their overall budgets they're committing to education? I like that you had combined in your presentation for us here that Northampton's net school spending is at 54.8% of the total budget when you add in benefits and other things. So I'm just wondering if there is like a comparison across that group of like what percent of their overall budget is going to education relative to Northampton. And the second question is sort of an inflation question, and it's around percent increases. So, I know you mentioned, and you pointed these things out, but it's a holistic question, which is, I know that step increases and contractual increases are at certain percentages, right? At least for Northampton MPS, it's 3% around the last contract. How do those stack up compared to non-salary increases that we're seeing? When we had the insurance figures up, those were looking 10, 11%. Like, what are the biggest percentages? And in terms of percent increase of spending, how do actually these salaries stack up to our other costs in terms of these increases? Like, what is really driving increases? If you compare, a 3% or 4% with step growth on a bigger pie versus a 11% growth on a smaller one, or even our second biggest portion, right, was the benefits, which has been high. Like, where does that kind of net out when you look across the pool of the entire city budget as the drivers? Like, essentially, like, what is actually, in what ways is we being impacted by those contracts, and in what ways are we being impacted by inflation in general, sort of at a global level? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so to your first, I don't, Director Artie, do we have any sense or data on the other comparison communities? What percent of overall of?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't, but I also just want to point out that those other communities as well, most of their net school spending is covered by Chapter 70. So I don't know what percent of their budget actually goes above that. That's certainly an interesting comparison, and we should probably look into that, but I don't have that off the tip of my fingers.
Okay. And then to Member Stein's second question.
So I would say, so our personnel actually is our largest cost for governmental budgets, is personnel costs. So those negotiated contracts hit the budget the biggest. Second, as the mayor said, the insurances That is a large percent in comparison, like what's driving, I would say, inflation has made a big difference, energy costs has, but personnel costs and the negotiated contracts is what really drives the budget to increase.
And then health insurance is there any sort of rhyme or reason as to what those percent increases are each year?
So
They
it-
fluctuate, but
So they do fluctuate, and 6% we're anticipating right now, but I think it may be it might be a little bit lower than that. And it all depends on what plans employees choose. I know there is some plan benefit changes within the GIC, so that will make a difference as well. Until it really plays out at this point, we just have the estimates for each of the individual categories.
okay. Thank you. Member Sarah P. Cox.
Yes, thank you. So I'm curious about two things. One, picking up on the fair share amendment conversation, I just want to clarify when you were talking about the transportation piece.
Yeah.
Were you saying that it was your understanding that the fair share amendment funds would be concentrated on education busing? Did I understand that correctly?
You understood it sort of as best as I understood. It was literally like one line that was said in the
Yes.
speech, and it was kind of almost amusing of we know, so picture this, right? Like it's a room filled with mayors and city councilors and select board members. And so she was like, I know you all want to talk about fair share, and I promise, I'm working on my budget, we're working on it, we're trying to figure it out. One thing we're looking at is whether, and I'm completely paraphrasing, but whether we use it to help with transportation costs like busing. So I don't think she was saying that would be like the entire use for it. It was really more of a wouldn't that be like, it's kind of putting the two things together. So maybe that's going to be a way that we're going to use this new revenue. That's like really all I've got for you, unfortunately.
Thank you for that clarification. I just was basically wanting to make sure that I heard correctly. Then the second thing is for the reserves. I saw that in FY22, the reserve balance went down a bit, and then is now, for FY23 is back up and is continuing to go up, right? The upward trajectory that you were talking about. So I'm curious, is there a reserves goal that we're trying to achieve? I heard you say something about 3 to 5% of the total budget. So like, where are we now? Where is our goal? Where are we trying to get to with it? And how will we know when we get there?
Right. So yes, you heard right. So according to our policy, 5% is the goal. And I said it, but kind of quickly, we have reached that for the general fund stabilization. We have not reached it for the other ones. So because we've reached it for that, we've also now added this climate stabilization. So we will look at whether we're gonna, now that we've reached it, we don't want to go above that. So we're going to figure out how we may reallocate it a bit. We have to now look at that now that we have sort of met our policy goal on that one. Does that make sense?
And you're saying we met it in FY23, or we're meeting it with a new budget?
We are meeting it now.
In FY23?
Yes.
Okay. And so then your plan for the reserves balance in FY24, then it's not like we're not going to see that same upward trend because you're saying we've met the goal.
Right, it will stabilize, certainly for that fund. The other ones, we haven't yet met the goal, but for that one, it will stabilize. And we will sort of, so we will rebalance how we handle that, the free cash that then gets divided.
And the general fund stability stabilization fund names, which is ostensibly like the override fund, as it were. Do you actually have a goal for that one, or is that a little bit of a almost like a buffer fund? Or I don't know, maybe you have an operating goal for that.
So it is, it's designed to be, so it was created and with an override, right? So in 2014 or 2013, when the override passed for FY 2014, we had like a big deficit, right? So part of it was, the majority of it was used to fill that hole. And then the remainder, which was about $775,000, was used to create this fund. Then for the next, trying to find my chart so I talk about it more intelligently. For the next few years, it helped, free cash was used in there in that planned way. And so it was increased. And then it actually was able to be, so during that time is when adult cannabis came online. So we actually were able to extend the time between overrides by a couple years. And then we started to go over what we call the fiscal cliff. And so we had to then draw from that fund to balance the budget. So you sort of start with that kind of first amount, sort of that smaller white amount that you saw. And then the next year you see it's a much larger amount. And then if you were to continue the next year, you would not have had enough in there to kind of fill that hole. So then we then passed the March 2020 override. So
more of the buffer kind of thing that I was, yeah, okay. Got it. Okay.
Kind of land use to get us between these periods.
Yeah.
Knowing that unless there's magically new revenue or enough new growth, that we will eventually get to a point where we do not have enough revenue. And we either need to cut or pass another general fund override to be able to sort of replenish that.
Great, thank you.
Dr. Spencer Robinson.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was super informative, really just a great resource for us to have. I appreciate as a taxpayer that we spend above net school spending. We invest that in our students' education. Really super important. I made some rough calculations that I will not stand by. But I think you said in terms of net school spending that it was $11 million for the Northampton Public Schools and $80,000 for Smith Vocational. And I don't know if I got that right, but if I did, I think that's about $4,000 per MPS student and about $700 per Smith Vocational student. And I think on another side, you said that that the city contributed about 14% of our Smith Vocational budget, but the Northampton students are 22% of our student body. So this is just a request to you and definitely our colleagues on the Northampton School Committee to try to keep that parity in mind when you're thinking about educational funding, and remembering that we take Northampton students who have gone through the K-8 system and serve them really well at Smith Voc, and certainly there's a higher cost of education because of the equipment that is required in the 15 shops that we have. So just to think that to keep that in mind, would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that. Member Goldman.
Hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. Really appreciate it. And I also want to thank you and your office and Dr. Nardi for the commitment to 4% for our school, our district. You had talked about, we are coming up against some numbers that we need to grapple with, as you know, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the cherry sheet and how things play out in this budget season. We know that how things look at the beginning of the budget season is never how they look at the end of the budget season, and yet you must work with some numbers during the budget season, and that's where we find ourselves today. When you were talking about the 2014, fiscal year 2014, you were talking about that quite large increase that was in part because of the override and because the percentage was so low. And and the way that it sort of went up and down, it was kind of erratic. And so I really appreciate the way the city has sort of tried to stabilize that number so that we're not dealing, I mean, when we're talking about those numbers, we're really talking about employees. We're talking about the livelihood of our educators and also of many of our citizens. So can you talk about, and also in the budget, it talked about the 1.4 gap from 2014. And I imagine the gap we're working with this year is more significant than that. And we're also dealing with sort of ESSER funds and pandemic education work that we need to sort of catch up on. All these numbers kind of shake out. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the city's sort of position on when that number can be increased. You know, if in the past we've talked about the gap, we've talked about the funding the schools need, and yet it feels like the 4% might not get us where we're at. Ideas about how we're going to fill up that gap.
You know, I don't have clear ideas on how to fill up that gap. As I mean, you know, having lived it for 3 years, there's a gap, as I said, because the schools sort of have their own stabilization fund, which is a school choice fund. And that has been, for a long time, sort of the policy was to, you know, that the amount that comes into that changes every year. The policy was to sort of use it carefully for one-time expenses. And that hasn't happened. And so there's a big gap there now. So it's almost like looking at its own, you know, fiscal stabilization fund, where it's now well below that baseline. And you know, the schools have, you know, these are perhaps better questions for Bobby Jones or Dr. Pearson Campbell. You know, the schools received some significant federal aid, so sort of like the equivalent of ARPA. The Northampton Public Schools got about $7 million in COVID relief funds, including ESSERS. I don't know where ESSERS was in 3 different stages. I'm not sure where ESSERS 3 stands right now. There also were CARES funds that came to the city that were passed through of over $1 million. So I'm not sure how to answer your question, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But we certainly don't want to create further holes elsewhere, right? So I feel like
Sure.
there's kind of this perfect example with school choice, with what happens when reserve funds are used in an out of balance way or for recurring expenses. So I think we have to look very carefully how to solve that problem.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think what I'm speaking to some extent is that I've been on the committee for 3 years, starting with the pandemic year, and our Bobby and Superintendent Pearson Campbell also were not around before that, but I know that you have been sort of involved with the city's financial ins and outs for some time now, including pre-pandemic times. And so it's just sort of trying to understand how the city approaches funding so many employees at the schools. You know, I know the schools take a very significant amount of funding, and I appreciate the city's generosity in sending money our way where they can. All absolutely duly noted, but just trying to get a sense of how do we fund and uphold the livelihood of so many people who rely on us, and trying to figure out how to make that work. As we are up against another gap with some serious concerns and falling funds. You know, we're not having some of the funding that has supported us through the pandemic still available. Okay, more soon. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. I mean, as you said, it's like I feel so strongly about being careful with these reserve funds because you are talking about people, right? You're talking about people's lives. And so that's why I believe so strongly in the fiscal stability plan that was created, and why I've supported it. And one of the reasons why I wanted to be mayor and be someone to help carry it forward, because it created this sort of remarkable stability, in particular for the schools, and got us out of that cycle. I mean, so you look at some of these years and they're dipping, you know, they're 2 years in a row of zeros in the early 2000s, sometimes going below zero. And then you'd kind of go up and then you'd go down. And those are like, it's charted on a graph, but those are people, those are our staff. And so to be able to create stability for them and their jobs, and therefore for our students, is so vitally important to me, and why I think it's just really, it's critical that we maintain the stabilization to be able to provide that kind of sustainable stability over time, in particular for the schools. Okay, before I go to second rounds, are there other questions from, I'm trying to make sure I can see you all. I remember from last year, and actually I remember sort of from being with both of you, that the styles are a little bit different between city council and school committee, between virtual hands and actual hands. So I'm trying to make sure I'm covering everybody. Okay, Member Levy.
Thanks. I've been hesitating to ask because I don't have this question fully formed in my head. So apologies if it sounds a little clunky. I want to follow up on Member Seraphy Cox's questions about the stabilization funds. I do appreciate all you presented. As somebody who doesn't really understand budgets that much, it was really, really helpful to hear the reasoning for all of the various stabilization funds, why it's important to have them. And without looking at the chart again, you know, I was looking at the comparisons between our taxes, our revenues, and our bond ratings with those of our neighbors. And I was looking specifically at Amherst and Longmeadow, who have seemingly higher taxes, more Chapter 70 funding, and yet, or Longmeadow doesn't, but Amherst does, and yet bond ratings that were slightly lower than ours. And I guess my question is, and I appreciate also the questions that have been coming, and I think people have been pretty, maybe we're not supposed to say out loud the exact number of dollars that we are in looking at in terms of the deficit for the budget for the schools. But it's a pretty sizable one. And so I guess I'm wondering, so I get, and I don't mean this to sound like a criticism, I truly just am curious to know more. So given the higher tax revenue of some of our neighbors and the lower bond ratings, I'm just curious why, like, yes, we want stabilization funds, I get that. And yes, we want to have these rainy day funds and they're all important. And we're getting closer to meeting our target or where we want to be, but we're not there yet. I guess I'm just wondering, in years like this, where we are looking at quite a deficit, is there, would it be okay to fund those stabilization funds, but not quite so much? Like, how do you determine the amount of funding that goes to those funds, especially given the makeup from COVID and the pandemic and the things that the schools are facing?
So I feel like the real question is, why can't those one-time non-recurring funds be used to fill the gap? Am I right?
Well, no, like, I think I understand why you can't just use those funds to fill the gaps, but I guess it's sort of like, could some funds be used to fill the gap? Like, not fill the entire gap, but could the stabilization funds be funded slightly less so, given the gap?
So I would just say to that question too, so remember that the funding that goes into the stabilization funds is one-time revenue. Like, it's revenue that the city generated for purposes that then was not used for those purposes. Like, for instance, our revenues came in higher, so then they get put into the undesignated fund, and then those one-time funds get fed into stabilization. So it's not like we're creating revenue and automatically putting it in. It's usually where it's from the budget that free cash comes from, and then it gets funneled into stabilization funds for those one-time costs. And I know the mayor is looking this year to really look at our revenues so that those aren't funded as much, and that we have more money to spend on the expenses of the city. But it's not like we're not giving the schools or our departments money and just funneling it to stabilization. That's not kind of how it works. So I don't know if I'm explaining that very well.
So unless there's that recurring revenue behind it, right? You're going to find yourself in a bigger hole the next year.
Right.
So while I understand why it feels like a fix or kind of a just get us through, what it does is then creates a bigger deficit in the following year. So it's kind of compounds the problem, it won't be a fix. Does that make sense?
Eventually you got to find a revenue source to fill the gap, or you need to make cuts. That's the way it usually works.
And since those compound every year, the amount gets bigger that you don't have a recurring source for.
And right now we're projecting for this coming year a 3.6% increase in revenues, and we're already giving the schools 4%, which is higher than our expected revenues. So that's not sustainable to continue. That can't continue on a yearly basis. So when we talk about the budget, we need to make sure that our increases are within our projected revenue growth. Otherwise, we will just continue to use all our sources, and then we will all be sitting with no money for any purpose, and we will have huge deficits everywhere. So one of the things I know the mayor is really looking at is making sure we're very responsible in using the city's stabilization for one-time sources and not leading us down a road where we can't ever fill those gaps. And then we end up with that roller coaster of increases and no increases and, you know, impacts on yearly on our staffing.
I'm trying to like read your face, Member Levy.
I know, I'm trying to like think, I'm trying to envision the graphs. Honestly, I think like I just need a crash course in like budget, like how funds, the growth of funds and how that implicates, because I think the thing that's hard to reconcile is seeing the numbers going up on the graphs for the stabilization funds, like those funds are growing. So like I'm hearing you that we don't want to rely on the funds because those funds won't necessarily be there the next year, except it seems like they are because they're growing. So but I don't need to take up more time with this. Like maybe I'll take one of you out for lunch and you can teach me.
You can come anytime and it's kind of a tough it's kind of a tough concept until it sort of clicks. At least it was for me. So we'll try and get it to click. But like Director Nardi said, so at 4% for both districts, that is higher than the 3.66% of the increase that we have. So it's already, it has to be pulled from somewhere to be able to allow that to happen. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, Member Stein, you're up again.
Thanks. This comment sort of draws on what Member Levy and Member Goldman and you were describing about the sort of school choice revolving fund. And I just wanted to sort of share this with my colleagues and also for our colleagues on the city council, they can sort of understand the differences in that fund compared to what Finance Director Nardi just stated about the other funds. Whereas we don't have unexpected revenues that we would add to that fund like the other stabilization funds. What that fund is money that we get as a district for school choice students choicing in to Northampton, and it's supposed to pay for the added expenses of educating them. The reason it's been used as a stabilization fund is because it's one of the few places that the district's allowed to have a revolving account. So essentially what happens is, rather than spend the money we've been giving for those kids' education, we try to hold on to a large portion of that so that each year it grows bigger and bigger and you can kind of use it like a stabilization fund. In recent years, that's been drawn down in order to balance the budget. But you know, I've suggested in our budget and property meeting that we have a larger conversation about how do we understand the point of school choice funding and how do we want to use it. And we also had a recommendation from the Director of Student Services to create a different type of recurring fund that's allowed under Massachusetts law, which is for unexpected special education expenses, which often is what ends up hitting that budget anyway. So I think we're sort of at a moment, given the way this has been depleted, where we should probably rethink how we're doing things moving forward. And I'd also suggest that maybe the city council consider I don't know, I don't have a snappy name, but like an excellence in education stabilization fund, or some sort of fund that actually can help offset these costs that's generated in a similar way to the other stabilization funds versus the sort of way in which we had been managing this before. So it's food for thought, but obviously happy to talk to any of my colleagues or any folks in the city council about this stuff, but just to understand the difference and what those monies were and sort of the cliff we finally find ourselves in because of the way those have been used. And yeah, I just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Thanks for that. And I think the recommendation of creating a special ed revolving funds is a great idea, because as you said, that's often what the school choice revolving fund was. That's an amount that fluctuates every year and can sort of very quickly have a large expense show up. So having a revolving account that could help just account or mitigate that, I think would be really helpful. Member Seraphy Cox.
Yeah, I just quickly will piggyback on the special education fund. I don't know that it's the panacea or whatever. I had discussed it just very briefly with Josh Dixon, the director of special education previously, not previously, I had previously discussed it with him and some others when it was brought up at some point. And he had mentioned that there are, pluses and minuses, but I think that potentially now is the time for us to do that. I mean, obviously we need to look further into it, but glad to hear more conversation about that. The reason I had originally raised my hand was I think things are starting to click for me as you were talking about the reserve fund pieces. And so, as the stabilization fund is now reached that 5% goal and is expected to stabilize in terms of the amount, then what happens to the funds that otherwise would have gone into it?
So, sorry, the heat is suddenly really very loud in here. There was a climate mitigation stabilization fund that was just started like in the last month.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think as I said, is we have to figure out how we're going to rebalance the allocation from that undesignated fund balance, which is an ever changing amount.
Mm-hmm.
The last couple years in particular, there's been a lot of challenges with maintaining staffing at like the budgeted level. So a lot of the turn back that we've had is because we have been down a lot of staff. So that's something that we very much hope is going to change and we can be fully staffed. But that's the kind of thing that you can't, you need to budget for that because those are people. And so they need to be able to have their salary there. But if there's a retirement or you're understaffed, that's going to get turned back. But that's an ever changing amount that happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Where's the city council at? You guys are very quiet. You all spend a lot of time with me, so pardon me. We're gonna spend a lot of time on Thursday together, let me tell you. Okay. I am looking and I don't see any other hands. Scrolling between two screens. All right, well, if there's Councilor Labarge, are you?
Yep.
Oh, hi. Do you want to say something? Hi.
Mayor, I want to thank you very much for the informative presentation that you gave this evening. And I really like hearing what Mr. Stein had talked about on doing or looking at an educational stabilization fund. And I'm glad to hear, Mayor, too, that you had and are showing some interest in that. But anyways, thank you anyways for this presentation.
You're very welcome, Councilor Labarge. Good to see you. Okay. If there are no further questions or comments, then Member Miller, are you gesturing? I see this.
I just wanted to say that there's questions or comments in the chat.
So this presentation doesn't have public comment and I don't know how to turn off the chat. So it's, this is really for these 3 elected bodies that are here.
I thought it was possibly members.
I don't think so. I will, the person who's in the chat, I know, and we'll be happy to back channel a conversation with her. So I don't think so. And you're welcome, Mr. Quadro, who's in the chat. All right. If there's nothing further that you all would like to discuss, then Laura, do we need to adjourn each body? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Where do you want to start?
The school committee would be great.
Okay, is there a motion? from the
Motion
school-
to adjourn.
Second.
Motion was made by member Seraphy Cox. The first second I heard was, I heard member Davis, but I heard one before then. Member Levy? Member Levy, okay. Motion was made and seconded. Roll call, please.
Mayor Shara,
Yes.
member Robbins,
Thank you, and yes.
member Gazy,
Yes.
member Seraphy Cox,
Yes.
member Stein,
Yes.
member Levy,
Yes.
member Miller,
Yes.
member Goldman,
Yes.
member Agna,
Yes.
and member Davis.
Yes.
Okay, school committee is adjourned. Moving on to Smith Folk and Agricultural High School, yes?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion's been made by Dr. Spencer Robinson, seconded by Dr. Pearson Campbell. Roll call, please, Laura.
Okay. Mr. Kaylane.
I'm not sure that he was present.
Dr. Spencer Robinson,
Yes.
Mr. Quadro,
I think he may have left.
was he
He was here, but maybe he may have left.
maybe no longer present, Mayor Shara,
Yes.
and Dr. Janelle Pearson Campbell.
Yes.
Okay, Smith Vocational Agricultural High School has been adjourned. Good evening. And last but certainly not least, the Northampton City Council.
Move to adjourn.
Thank you.
Motion's made by Counselor. You could do this, Council President. I feel like I'm stepping on your job here. I heard the motion was Counselor Elkins, who was the second?
Councilor
I think that
Labarge, it
was me.
sounded like.
Or Counselor Perry. We were at the same time. So Counselor Perry?
Matter.
Sure.
Okay.
Roll call, okay. Counselor Elkins,
Yes.
Counselor Foster,
Yes.
Counselor Gore,
Yes.
Counselor Jarrett,
Yes.
Counselor Labarge,
Yes.
Counselor Maori,
Yes.
Counselor Moulton,
Yes.
Counselor Nash,
Yes.
and Counselor Perry.
Yes.
Okay, you're adjourned. Thank you all so very, very much. It was great to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.